Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist podcast. I am your host, Chris Cogswell, here with a special bonus episode. I am talking to two guys that do a podcast that I have fallen really hard in love with. I love your guys' show, the Semi-Intellectual Musings podcast. I am joined here by Matt and Phil. Guys, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having us.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh my goodness, so exciting. So, guys, why don't you tell people a little bit about your show and kind of, what brings you here on the Mad Scientist?
Well, like in a nutshell, our show is a social science, arts, and humanities podcast, hosted by Phil and myself, Matt. And we cover a variety of topics, kind of whatever strikes our fancy, and then we just do like the most ridiculous deep dive on it. It's kind of our approach, and we try to have fun along the way. It's not a super serious show, but we like to say that we take the research very seriously.
Yeah, totally. So what I really like about your guys' show is actually the kind of this, not the spin necessarily, kind of the edge that you bring to these topics and the stuff that you talk about. It's kind of, there's a lot of shows out there kind of similar to, say, like my show, right? Where people are talking about kind of the physical sciences, right? But with your guys' show, you're talking about, these, the social sciences in a way that I think is really, really cool. And that's, in many ways, the social sciences are sort of the sciences that are the most, I think, interesting and fun to talk about, right? That's, the social sciences are where people interact with science, really, right? People don't necessarily, people may not ever think about a catalyst and whether or not it's good for a specific type of reaction, right? Who cares if platinum or palladium is better? But people will think about questions in, social sciences, things like bioethics and anthropology and sociology and stuff like that. So tell us a little bit, I guess, about what do you guys do? What made you think to start a podcast, I guess?
Well, that's a funny story. Well, I guess like Matt and I have been friends for, what is it now? 8 years, 9 years, almost a decade now, right?
Yeah, aging us and also
we
scary.
met. That is a little scary. Well, we met doing our master's degree.
Okay.
So I was doing my master's in sociology. Matt was doing his in anthropology, and at Carleton University in Ottawa. And we had these like extreme, I'd call them like extreme writing sessions, basically to finish up. So like we'd basically lock each other into a writing mode at Library and Archives Canada and write for like 10 hours a day until it was done. That's basically how we finished our master's degrees. And, over the course of our friendship and listening to podcasts, I kind of just decided to say, hey, there isn't anything out there that really appeals to the social science, humanities, and arts community that tries to make things accessible and tries to connect like the, social theories and the sort of things that we talk about on a day-to-day basis within the department to like regular life outside. So if you look through our catalog of episodes, these are all things that we've talked about at one time or another at a pub. And that's kind of the feel that we're kind of going for, is having a repertoire of things that you would just chat about with your buddies over drinks or maybe over dinner or whatever. And they're things that like affect us. But we always bring kind of the research or the science, like I said, the social theory or the anthropological side to it. And that's what we try to do.
Yeah, and it's like for me, it's also to popularize our two disciplines and the arts and humanities and the social sciences in general. And I feel like academics struggle with making their work accessible. And to me, I probably speak for Phil as well, we find this stuff like genuinely fascinating, and kind of analyzing the world around us with the stuff we learned in university is just like an endlessly fascinating pursuit. So when it seems like we're having fun along the way, that is genuine. And also I think the goal is to try to make the stuff that goes on in the ivory tower kind of make it accessible for people.
Yeah, I think in some ways actually it's funny because the people kind of have this weird almost dual view of the social sciences, right? Where on the one hand, you have scientists, like physical scientists, right? People who you'd normally, I think, people would normally ascribe to the term or title scientists, right? People, in lab coats mixed in chemicals or whatever. They tend to, in some cases, look down on the social sciences, right? And there's even this famous, this famous question in philosophy of science: are the social sciences, right? That's sort of, every third year philosophy major who's also in a science class has asked that question, right? And then probably done a paper on it at least once.
Yeah.
I know I certainly did. And on the other hand, then, the social sciences are almost looked at by the public as this very, far away ivory tower thing, right? Where it's kind of, it's the view that people have of philosophy as well, right? It's people, making these theories up and then just talking about their theories altogether, but there really is no application to the real world. What do you say to people that have that view, right? That these things have no application?
Okay, so I'll kick it over to Phil, like, real quick, and Phil, you take the ball and run with it. But part of this is, like, us not marketing ourselves well.
Sure.
In various disciplines, because what we do in the so-called ivory tower, like, the topics we pursue have real-world import. They're always political. They're, like, my research, for example, was on concussions, right? I study medical anthropology. So, like, I don't know. I like to think that we pick our topics because they have political or real world import. But you're right. Nobody really knows what we do, and, like, nobody for sure knows what anthropology is. So, but yeah, I think it's a problem of marketing. But I'll let Phil be a little more articulate there.
Yeah, like, I could talk about this forever, but I think the way I'm going to approach it is basically to say that there is a dualism between, or a so-called dualism between the applied versus the exploratory realm of research. So applied research are things that lead to discovery automatically. There's an ROI, return on investment. It can make money. And it has a so-called real-world application. Mm-hmm. And the hard sciences, engineering, I'm going to attack chemical engineers, are really good at doing that sort of research, right?
We're really good at it.
Yeah.
No, we're great at it, in fact.
And we're good at doing our homework on any show we're about to go on. I got a list, too, over here, too.
Oh, my goodness, of zingers to throw at me. I see how it is, guys. You know what? Semi-intellectual musings, two thumbs down. That's it. It's happened. All right.
Quiver full of arrows.
Telling you, man. Killing me. Okay.
So in the public view, everything that a chemical engineer does is applied research, but what doesn't get seen is the exploratory research that goes into it. Mm-hmm. So the minutes in a lab that are actually kind of failed experiments, right? Those things are just as important as the successful experiment that goes to market. And in the social sciences, there's a general public consciousness that all we do are failed experiments. Very few of it is actually applied research. But no one critiques the hard sciences for their failed attempts, right? No one says, wow, it took you a long time to discover how to, make that catalyst, or, geez, it took NASA such a long time to figure out how to go to the moon. Poo-hoo on them. But yet, when you look at, economists, for example, who are studying things like poverty, people say, well, why are they still studying it? Shouldn't they have found a solution to it, right?
Right.
It's like, no, there are social problems that take a very long time to come up with a solution, and there is never a single sole solution to the problems that we face. It requires exploratory research. It requires going out and talking to so many different people, hearing so many different voices, and then assembling that. And this is kind of like, regardless of your research methodology, right? You can be doing statistical research. You still have to go out there and get that data. And at the end of your data collection, it might not actually lead to anything. You might say, wow, I was approaching the question wrong. This isn't the right question to ask. So you come back to the drawing table. And I feel like the social sciences gets a really bad rap because in the public consciousness, that's all we're doing, and it doesn't lead to anything. When I position some of the stuff on our show as saying, everything that we do is valuable at some point, even if it's not valuable right now for a business, for example.
So it's actually really interesting. I think, in some ways you're actually touching on a subject that is becoming so I kind of have two things I wanted to say quick in response to that. So first off, the notion, it's funny you brought up poverty, right? Poverty has been a problem that we've been looking at, or at least thinking about. Historians and artists and writers and thinkers, philosophers have been thinking about poverty and kind of the implications of poverty since before we knew that cancer was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's almost it's a problem that is it's a problem that has been with us since forever. And then on top of that too, it's at least in kind of the fields that I think you are both in, the subject that you're studying, societies or cultures or peoples, change so rapidly, right? Comparatively to say something like biology or even a disease, where diseases, of course, can mutate and change very quickly, but ultimately, the human cell has been the same for millions of years, right? So at some point, it's kind of like you're given almost a shorter time period to do the study and make the changes, whereas your problems are almost bigger and more. I would argue in some cases even more entangled and intense, right? The other part that I was going to say that I actually think you bring up a very, very good point is in that distinction between science of any sort that ends up with a return on investment versus science that kind of sticks in the lab or sticks in the ivory tower, so to speak, right? One of the biggest issues right now for science is that we have focused so much on those experiments that are successful. We focus so much on selling our work that we're at a point now where people are publishing fake work, right? And the public has lost trust in the sciences and the hard sciences, especially because we've oversold our results for so long, right? You can only say you've cured cancer so many times before people, start buying crystals and stuff. So actually,
or bee pollen,
right?
Whoa. So maybe like Phil can tackle the publish or perish kind of thing, because I think he's got interesting things to say about that. But I got to jump in on that culture change thing, and also poverty and healthcare. So there's a field. It's not new. It's been around for say 25, 30 years or so. They tend to call it public health, right? So you see something like poverty and you look at the health dimensions of it, or vice versa, right? So we look at like the environment and the implication it literally has on people's health. And you can do that on a statistical level, or you can do my style of research where I might knock on somebody's door and try to talk to them for an hour. So I just wanted to throw that in terms of poverty. But with culture change, I think it's kind of interesting. Like, it seems like culture is changing really rapidly because of the times that we're living in right now. Everything seems to be moving really fast. But it's kind of like a rule of thumb in the social sciences that societies and cultures take a lot to change, and they take a long time to change.
Sure.
They're actually not rapidly changing. Now, this is a classic at a pub debate where you're like, do cultures change fast or slow or whatever, right? But typically it's like, if a society is going to change, it's going to be something like the Bolshevik Revolution that is going to massively change. Now, when we see culture changing, it seems more like they're almost superficial changes, I would argue. But like the root norms, stigmas, taboos that are embedded into culture, like deeply, those are the things that I think remain somewhat stable.
Actually,
and
so
it's a bit of a philosophical debate, but
no,
I don't know.
Well, I think it's actually really interesting because that for me was probably one of the most, I think, transformative kind of things that I read. So when I started thinking about seriously pursuing this show as an option, like it's something that I wanted to really spend money and time doing, right? And really starting to put my research efforts in this realm, it was during my undergraduate degree when I was reading a lot of philosophy of science and a lot of, just a lot of kind of going through the philosophy curriculum of an undergraduate, right?
Yeah, I
But
heard you drop Kuhn's name on the
oh yeah,
previous
of
show,
course.
so I was just like, wow, okay. And you spoke of him like you actually read him, and
Yep.
same with Descartes. I'm like, oh
Yeah.
wow, you actually know that he was a moral philosopher. He wasn't a philosopher of science. That's interesting.
Oh yeah. Oh no, yeah. I read all the big ones, all the terrible
Okay, cool.
ones. I think the only one that I managed to kind of get away with not reading was Wittgenstein. Thankfully,
Ooh.
Yeah.
because I was not about that life. And actually, instead of in the senior, like the two final years of so junior and senior year of the undergrad degree at UNH, they have a lot of really cool courses you can take. And so because I'm a big science guy, I took a philosophy of science course, and then a course specifically on Wittgenstein was taught. And instead of taking the Wittgenstein course, I actually took a course on kind of like Marxist philosophy and
Ah, good for you.
critique and stuff. Well, because it's one of those.
We'll get into that.
I can get.
Yeah, Phil's chomping at the bit. I can hear it from here.
Yeah, we can get real hard into that, but anyways, because frankly, I was most interested in I guess I hesitate to call it its own specific subset, but almost the philosophy of engineering and the application of science to the physical world, and really,
Materialism.
exactly, and determinism, kind of, and economic
for
determinism in particular, has a big role in that. But anyways, the thing that I was going to say, although now I think I've completely forgotten it because I've gotten so. Oh, right, okay. The you're just I'm just we're nerding out here about philosophy so hard, and ideas and things. Probably one of the most really transformative things for me was I'm in these courses and everything, and I'm starting to think hard about the question, why is it that people believe incorrect things, right? Or why do people believe irrational things or non-scientific things, or why do people not trust science or engineering or whatever, but they will trust politics on these questions, right? Things like global warming and stuff.
But you're asking. Sorry. But you're asking people to trust something that you believe to be real.
Well,
Right?
so yeah. Well, no.
Isn't that just a faith? Isn't that a faith question
See,
in
well,
and of itself?
that's one of the major questions, right? Is science, is scientific reality objective versus
Exactly.
a metaphysical reality, right? But so
Exactly.
one of the biggest things though for me was reading some kind of sociology works on witchcraft trials and belief in magic and occultism and things and conspiracy theory, and realizing or learning that this idea that societies change quickly, well, that's like you said, or cultures change quickly rather, is mostly a superficial change, it appears, right?
Right.
So, and that's kind of the point that we try to drive home constantly on the show is we still believe in magic, we still believe in all that stuff. Now we just call it quantum entanglement, or we call it aliens or whatever, right? Like the underlying beliefs haven't really changed. Anyways, so actually, I'm actually quite interested. So Matt, you did kind of public health, medical anthropology, right? I think is what you called it.
Yeah. So like public health is more on a sort of macro,
Sure.
kind of like a provincial sort of level or state level. But mine was much more grounded. So my research was in concussions.
Okay.
I have obviously a wicked number of concussions as well. So my methodology was like a reflexive approach. So I used my own experiences in my interviews with people, athletes who have concussions, and then I also interviewed medical professionals who treat athletes with concussions.
Okay.
So I did like 2 sets of interviews.
Interesting. And Phil, you are in sociology. Do you want to give us kind of the quick? I know this is a hard challenge for any graduate student. Give us like the quick, the 50-second, if you can do it, rundown of your thesis.
Yeah.
Right. Let's
sure.
just distill 6 years of your life into a. Right?
I could actually. Well, I'm going to go back to my master's degree. So my master's degree, I fell in love with historical sociology, and I decided to investigate the first organized municipality of Upper Canada, which is now Ontario. Happens to be in a town called Brockville, and it took the form of a police board or a board of police. So I basically traced the formation of the board of police, leading to the incorporation of the city. And that kind of led me to these questions around what sort of stories do municipalities tell or make over the years. So my current PhD research is actually about the historical sociology of the concept of resilience and how it applies to municipal governing structures. So I'm looking at the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities campaign and tracing how the concept or the story of resilience gets picked up and changed in policy work.
So by resilience, what do you mean exactly? Like what? I guess that's kind of what you're getting at, but
Yeah, very much so.
right.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, what is justice, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, what a question. Do you mean I guess sort of the ability to bounce back from tragedy? Do you mean the ability to kind of maintain a standard of living? Like what resilience in terms of economics, in terms of I don't know, demographics? Like what do you mean by that?
It can be all of those things.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
You know,
all right.
part of- yeah.
You guys in your ivory towers. I'm sick
Yeah,
of you.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know.
Yeah,
No.
but so this
Depends
is,
on your
this
body
is-
positionality.
This is the interesting thing with my research is like resilience has become a buzzword. No one can pin down exactly where it comes from, but I go back actually to Bacon and the scientific method and show that he actually used a form of the word and kind of trace it to the present through scientific literature, and then I end up at municipalities and I say, they want to capitalize on the buzzword for a variety of reasons, but what are the real world implications of these policies? So take, for example, a so-called coastal strategy, dealing with climate change and dealing with the erosion of the coast. They're going to call that, a resilience strategy. They're going to have a whole bunch of targets that they're going to try to aim for, and they're going to put in a whole bunch of predictive models for data to show how many years do we have left, what's the coastal erosion over time. They're going to run all these sorts of models about human behavior, how do people adapt to the erosion of the coast, where will people move to, economic models for the impact of the erosion of the coast, all these sorts of things. And what I'm showing in my research is that all these different predictive models, all these sorts of ways in which we view communities at the municipal level are rooted in this concept of resilience, the ability to bounce back. So how much stress is a leader of a community, say a mayor or the town council, willing to put on a certain population, say the homeless? So we say, well, let's save the rich communities, but the homeless communities over there, doesn't really matter. They can adapt. They're going to move, right? And those are kind of like, so I'm jumping from the philosophical and kind of theoretical question of what a word means down to the very practical, in the sense that you could almost envision seeing someone next to the coast being eroded who isn't accounted for in that policy. So who is spoken for and who is impacted by resilience policies is kind of really important going forward as we see more and more strategies to deal with the unknown.
That's really interesting. It's actually it's odd. So in our little area here where we live in St. Paul, in Minnesota in the United States, and where we are, Minnesota has or the Twin Cities at least have a very large homeless population, right? And I'm always very, very surprised, or I've been very surprised this last winter with how brutally cold it gets here. It still seems like there manages to be still quite a relatively constant population of homeless individuals, right? And it's because it's so cold, though, I would think that just in terms of climate, it would be almost an easier challenge, I think, for say municipalities to tackle, because they don't have to worry about people. If you become displaced or homeless, it just seems to me like it would make sense for you to move if you could. But of course, that hump of if you could is a big challenge, right? I mean, you wouldn't be homeless, you know what I mean, if in that instance necessarily. But
so out here, sorry, I'll just say, like, I'm from Vancouver, and like there you can live outside all year round. It gets pretty cold in the dead of winter, but like freezing, that's it, right? But here in Ottawa, it's like Minnesota weather as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have for the capital city of Canada, like we have a fair size homeless population as well. And it seems like there is enough shelter beds, but in Vancouver, it's a real problem with not enough places to house the homeless. So that's why it seems like there's just so many more out there.
Sure. Well, yeah. Well, that's actually kind of what I was getting at. I think was that it seems interesting to me that this problem, a problem that on its surface seems very simple, right? Has all these layers to it. Stuff like you were saying, the number of available beds or the literal ability to, right? This area, the Twin Cities, we're surrounded by fields and farms and stuff, right? So it's not exactly like there's any place to go, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So that also leads to this continuing issue and stuff. And so whenever I talk to people about this, or, whatever the point is always made, like, I always expect it to be, I never would have expected it to be so bad here, right? This challenge of homelessness and putting people in beds and everything else. But again, I think it is just a matter of kind of what you were saying, all of these things, all these ideas coming together, and then I don't know. I guess I hesitate to call it resilience, I guess, because I don't know what that word means. Really, I think talking to you has made me sure of that at least. But it makes me wonder, though, kind of, I guess, the impulse. So in engineering, there's this idea of impulse and then response in a system, right? So for instance, if you're looking at like the pH of a solution, say your pool or whatever, right, a big body of water, if you add, I don't know, a bunch of acid or something in, the pH will drop, right? So there's an impulse, but eventually, if the system is big enough, that impulse will then eventually just be kind of evened out, and so at the steady level stays constant, right? So I wonder, almost this in the same way, can this population or can social challenges like this, like poverty or homelessness or whatever, I wonder if you can see, or a similar effect is occurring here, where you have, okay, a momentary impulse, but because the situation's so big, because the population is so large, because the problems are so intertwined, that your system is almost built in such a way that it retains what we in engineering would call steady state, right? So your, say, total poverty level never drops below, I don't know, 15% or something, but it never goes above 25 either, but you're always around that same level. So no matter how much you try to change it, it takes a big impulse to make a big dent, right?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I do pick up on is how the models of resilience in engineering get imported into other fields. Because what you're describing is visual. Yeah, totally. It's a nice story. It's a nice metaphor. And it's a certain way of envisioning how human behavior can come together. And when you have a model, when you have a theory like that, you can then go out and test it. And you can begin to ask questions about it, right? But there are implicit biases found in that. So your steady state, for example, has been kind of the model used for things like poverty, things like unemployment. So if the unemployment rate remains at 4%, we're happy. Impossible to have an unemployment rate less than 7%. And I'm just throwing these numbers out there, but they're not that far off. So when you have a model that says the world is constructed around things that have steady states, they will have steady states, right? But if we take a moral stance and say, no, that steady state of poverty, that steady state of unemployment is unacceptable, we have to aim for zero. Then you can develop policies with that in mind. Otherwise, you're developing policies for the 96% and leaving 4% out of the equation.
Right. You're trying to just get as good as we can, not perfect, not
or maintain the status quo.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's super interesting. So
so I just tack on to that, like when a concept like resilience gets applied to the health fields, like my area of research, the linguistic qualities of it, they take on new meanings, right? So if you talk to somebody like myself who's had the amount of concussions I've had, and a doctor tells me to be resilient and tells me to bounce back, what does that mean? Like, should I go take up hockey again? Like, should I go maybe I'll go play defense this time, right? And then also you see other terms that kind of get cast, like that fall out of favor. So I'm thinking of the term survivor, but also victim, and something that Phil raised on one of our episodes in the past, and I thought it was kind of interesting. I thought it was very interesting. Was this idea that we don't really say people are coping anymore with
Sure.
their illness,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Or just putting up with it. So it's interesting. Like that is an example where culture changes really rapidly, is in the linguistics, but the meanings there, those are the things that are kind of stable.
Right. So the underlying idea is still there,
Yeah,
even if we
yeah,
call it something different.
yeah. And an
Sure.
anthropologist, we would call that a symbol, basically, but the meanings behind things. Yeah.
So wow. So that's really interesting. So I mean, so obviously our show deals with weird stuff, right? And
I love weird stuff, man. That's why I studied anthropology.
it's great, right? I know it's funny actually. The more I learn about anthropology, and kind of the ideas and things behind it, the more I'm like, man, I should really go back to school.
We get that a lot, and that's what I mean that we're bad at marketing ourselves. Because I had the same thing. I was in university for my undergrad was 8 years long, and then I ran out of courses to take. I was taking ancient Middle Eastern history with a religious studies focus, and I just ran out of classes, and I stumbled into an Anthro 101 class because that's where all my credits transferred the most over into. First class, fell in love with it. I'm like, oh my goodness, why didn't somebody tell me this like 9 years ago?
Right, this would have been really this would have been really good.
Thousands of
right,
dollars.
right,
Well,
so many
exactly,
dollars
right.
ago.
Yeah.
So actually, that kind of brings me to, I guess, kind of a foundational question, or I think a really good question for our listeners who may honestly not know much about either of your fields of sociology or anthropology. So actually, quick, I'm gonna start with you, Phil. What would you say are kind of the if so when people ask me what are the kind of quick and dirty like top 3 ideas of chemical engineering, right? What I like to tell them are things like well, energy is always minimized if possible, right? Your the mass that you put into a system has to be the mass you get out, and same with energy. The energy in has to be equal to the energy out, and basically, mathematics is just a tool. Those are kind of the big things that I took away from my engineering degree and kind of what I apply, I think, every day. If you had to kind of give, I guess, a quick and dirty, like, what is one sociological concept or idea that you wish more people in the public knew about?
Oh boy. Sociology is quite broad.
Sure,
Before I
yeah,
answer
of
the
course.
question, my kind of realm of sociology is historical sociology. So I, half history, half sociology. But I also do science and technology studies, which is a field in sociology that is intra, and multidisciplinary. So I think one of the things going forward is the sort of disciplinary boundaries that we used to have are eroding, and those lines are getting blurred. So the sociology of like the 1950s and 1960s, that 1970s even, that was characterized by structuralism. A rigorous sociologist finds structure in the social realm and will find laws of the social. Though that was kind of the way to explain sociology around that time. Those are eroding. So now we have something like the linguistic turn, where we look at the language that we use. Postmodernism have shown us that there are multiple sort of viewpoints, multiple realities in which people can live and construct their lives. So a good scholar of the postmodern sociology will, examine that in a dispassionate way. So I guess one message that I would have, and the message that I kind of tell my first year students, is sociology can be what you make it. If you can justify your methodological approach, if you can justify your research question and justify why you're going about asking a question, it can be sociology. And I think that openness of the discipline is one of its essential characteristics. So no longer are you bound to just study human behavior in sociology. You can study the interaction of technologies in humans, laws in humans. We have legal scholars, for example, who barely even talk to people. They study law. That's considered sociology. So I think being a little bit open as to exactly how we define it is one of its essential characteristics. If that makes any sense,
Sure. No, it absolutely does. I think it's interesting to me actually that I guess so the view I always had of sociology almost was not, so I guess maybe because I was taught in, I guess, kind of the postmodern phase of this field, right? So how would you characterize, I guess, the beginning of this new shift over in thinking, let's say towards linguistics, towards postmodernism, for the listeners at home?
The 80s, usually.
Yeah, so the 80s, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Basically.
So,
Give or take, but basically.
one of the defining moments in social theory was the translation of French philosophy into the English language. So we actually imported a lot of the French philosophical texts into social theory. And at the time, they were kind of combining social studies, history, philosophy, and psychoanalytics. And they quickly found that language and how we define things are an essential component to the human experience.
Sure.
And that kind of was like a radical turn for North American sociology. And we have scholars like Michel Foucault, for example, who said, well, how we look at the ways in which our lives are governed, the structures that govern us, is embodied in how we live as humans and, how we view our potential as human, for example.
Sure.
Those aren't questions that are asked by the people like Talcott Parsons or Popper even, right?
Sure.
They don't care about human potential. They're not asking those existential questions. They're asking very structuralist, what are the laws of nature and how are they reproduced, sorts of questions. And then Foucault comes along and says, no, it's not about that. It's actually about what does this represent to us? So you have this thing called the insane asylum, but what does that represent and how does it function? And that sort of move happened in the 80s and 90s. There was a chipping away of Marxism as well that happened. We used to have this duality, whereas you were a Marxist or you weren't a Marxist. And if you were a Marxist, you did certain types of research. And if you weren't, then you did the other. And it was this very kind of dualist camp. That sort of structure got chipped away. And now to say that you are a Marxist sociologist, people kind of roll their eyes at you. You're not really going to do that. You're actually probably doing something else,
Right.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it's funny. It's funny to me that it's funny to me though too that the listeners at home who may not be kind of involved in, I guess, sort of, academic kind of views of Marx and Marxist philosophy and stuff, when they hear Marxist, they think something very different, again, because of the way that language is used.
Right.
Yeah.
Versus, right? I mean, so they're
Absolutely.
thinking,
Like, I'm a socialist.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, how does that make everyone feel? Like, what does that make you think?
right. It is interesting to me, kind of, I guess, I saw an article the other day that I thought was very interesting. I actually haven't had a chance to read it. It's been sitting open on my phone. But the article says, Marx's philosophy was right. His economics sucked. Right.
Yeah,
It's, and it's sort of an interesting thing that, I don't think people realize just how much of our modern, criminology, sociology, anthropology, even economics to some extent, and, bioethics.
100%. There's dominant fields of economic sociology and economic anthropology as well.
Oh,
Those are big fields.
Sure.
Yeah.
I always find it interesting or funny when people will claim, oh, you're a Marxist, right? Or you're a Stalinist or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, kind of all of science is Marxist at the moment, kind of, sort of, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of still operating in that same.
It's very communal.
Yeah.
Like the animal kingdom it's all interconnected.
It's
right?
all great, yeah.
Hey,
Anyways,
anybody who's done a peer review has been a really good Marxist.
Yeah. So Matt, why don't you give us kind of the same short and dirty, I guess, kind of view of anthropology, or I guess I should say, because again, with sociology and anthropology, I think it's interesting. So when people, I think, say those terms to a sociologist or anthropologist, it's like if someone called me an engineer, right? Like, I am an engineer, but there's very, I can't design a piece of software, or I can't even put together a circuit, right? I can't even change the tires of my car. You know what I mean? Like, I could probably figure it out, but I'm not going to.
I think for Phil and I, that feeling of like, whoa, comes when someone's like, oh, well, you're an expert in, like, Phil's an expert in society, and Matt's an expert in culture. It's like, whoa, no, that's impossible.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. That these fields are much broader, or there's a lot more depth here than there is in other, I guess, specialties, just because of the way the words are used. Again, getting back to this linguistics thing. So Matt, what I guess would be your big takeaways, I guess, from what you've learned so far in anthropology or as an anthropologist?
Well, so yeah, it was kind of interesting. Like I get it a lot. Like nobody knows what anthropology is, right?
Sure.
Like most of the people think it's archaeology,
Mhm.
which confusingly enough is one of the branches of anthropology. Or the other people think that a dinosaur hunter or whatever, right? Like I'm picking up,
Paleontologist.
yeah, paleontologist. That's it. For some reason I never forget that word, but I did there. So basically, anthropology is like in a nutshell is a study of human culture. But as Phil was saying with sociology, where like the disciplinary boundaries have opened up, same thing happened in anthropology in the 80s for different reasons, but the result was the same. So in anthropology, you can study human culture, you can study animal culture, you can study the interaction between animals and humans. You can theorize about landscapes, so like the natural physical environment and how that impacts humans and vice versa. So it's broadened out that way, but in a nutshell, it's culture, and what we mean by culture is the symbolic meanings. So the meanings that we ascribe to our kind of lived experience, like
Sure.
the things that we perceive. History is a huge component in anthropology, just like Phil's a historical sociologist, but in anthropology, history is usually throughout the whole discipline in some way or another. And then also a key feature of anthropology is like I would do analysis as an anthropologist based on the things people have told me and like say their transcripts from their interviews.
Mm-hmm.
But the analysis usually is at the very least 50-50, if not the majority coming from them. Like our participants are actually the one doing the analysis. We're just sort of applying some theory to help the process along. So that's a really key component of anthropology, and it's a hallmark of the sort of postmodern turn from the 80s on, where we sort of took like the authority away from the anthropologist who's supposed to like kind of know everything and be the expert, and giving it back to the real experts, the people we work with, right? And then like the last piece in American anthropology, and that's what I study, there's 4 fields, right? Cultural anthropology, so that would be what I did with the concussion people, so going out and talking to people, like, or the classic image of going to some far off village and living with them for like a year. That's a cultural anthropologist. And then there's also biological and physical anthropology. So those are the people who will either dig up the bones and analyze the human remains or organic remains, so like pollens and things like this, so plant remains, and recreate life that way. Or they've been used currently or more recently to go out to the sites of mass burials, mass graves after genocides, and help identify bodies. So that's what physical or biological anthro does. And then there's linguistics, which is a huge field in anthropology. It's all language, as Phil says.
Sure.
And then archaeology is the 4th field.
Sure. So where would you guys, I guess, I'm sure you've had many arguments about this over drinks. How would you distinguish sociology from anthropology and vice versa?
That's the killer question, isn't it?
If it was just me and Phil together, that would be the night of conversation right there. It's like that's just the start point, and then we just go. But if we're in like the proverbial cocktail party sort of setting,
sure.
The quick answer is like Phil studies society or social organizations, Matt studies culture and cultural meanings. That would be the sort of
and so just to be clear to the listeners,
and at that point, I bite my tongue and I look really angry,
and then I almost just threw a caveat into that as well. So.
Okay, I was gonna say for the listeners, just to be clear, you did just describe yourself as Matt in the third person. So that's good too. So that's good. Interesting.
That's
it's called ethnographic distancing.
Actually, that's actually a really good question for you guys. What is your favorite, or I guess I should say, what is the most if you had to pick a piece of jargon to I don't know, to use in a title or something, or right. So for me, my favorite jargon in engineering is or in chemical engineering and chemistry generally, my favorite jargon is fugacity, because it means nothing to anybody. It is what fugacity is one of those things where if you ask your professor in undergraduate or graduate school how do they describe fugacity, they will either if you're in graduate school, they will shake their head and say nobody knows, and if you're an undergrad, they will look at you sternly and give you an answer that's kind of right but kind of wrong. Fugacity is technically, it is, and again, I'm definitely going to butcher it here. Fugacity is the real pressure of a system versus its ideal pressure if it was an ideal gas.
Oh yeah, no, I know.
No man,
So,
I know what fugacity is. Are you kidding me? What? So what would be?
I
what
know
would
the word
be,
gas.
There you go. So we're okay. So we're doing fine. What would you guys say is your favorite piece of jargon in each of your fields?
Yeah. I got one
go
like
first.
just off the top of my.
I think I know
Yeah,
what
I
yours
got one.
is, so go,
That's
yeah.
a good one. Yeah, you know what it is. So it's a philosophy term. I used existentialist phenomenology in my research, believe it or not. So the I know.
Oh,
I know.
Man.
So my favorite term, and I use it around the house constantly, is gestalt.
Yes. Oh my goodness, it's so funny.
I just gestalted all over these pod notes right now.
It's one of those words where it's like
it's disgusting.
oh my
sounding.
goodness, it's terrible word. It's like I think every philosopher, every I guess academic, not even just philosophy, every academic has a word, like if they become famous, they have a word like that they start using, right? So like for Sartre, it was freedom. Right? What Sartre means by freedom, it's like, okay, that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that to anybody else, right?
It's just another word for nothing left to lose, right?
Right, yeah, pretty much, right? It's another word of his myriad words for angst at the end of everything. It's so funny. So okay, so Gestalt. So what for the listeners, how would you come to define Gestalt?
I believe it's a sudden realization. Like you're like, oh, eureka! Like it's a light bulb moment. But to me, like an alternate definition would be when you're laughing, but then accidentally like snot comes out of your nose. That would be a gestalt.
Oh, gestalted! Oh my gestalt!
Hope nobody was eating.
I'm trying to think. I know in my head. Did Hegel use gestalt all the time?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna say
it's a German like pre-psychoanalytic philosophical psychology sort of
so
approach.
It's like
Gestalt psychology.
It's like
and that's what
Spirit.
Merleau-Ponty
It's like all those other ones, right? Okay, yeah. Ridiculous. Okay, Phil, how about for you? Now that we've gestalted everywhere.
I actually have two. So my first one I think is kind of in between Matt and I. It's a word, so I might mispronounce it, but it's ethnomethodology.
Okay. That's intimidating.
It's just like it's basically like a word ethno and then tacked onto another word method and then ologized, and it's just one of these things that's like, well, everyone does it, but no one does it. Yeah, and some people specialize in it.
I'm trying to think, like, what does that even mean, man?
Well, okay, so...
but it means everything, man.
Yeah, well, that's it. And, okay, so I have a definition in front of me, okay? So it was developed by Garfinkel, and this is... I'm going to quote the definition, because this is, like...
It sounds like a guy would make this word up.
Garfinkel gestalted.
Yeah.
All the time.
Over ethnomethodologies.
Yeah. So it's basically the assumption of someone's background and how that helps them make sense of everyday situations. So... basically how one lives their life.
Just a really complicated word for being a person with a working brain. Okay.
Yeah, working memory.
Being a conscious, right? Yeah, a conscious mind in the world. All right.
Yeah. And the other one, which is much more closer to sociology, and it's becoming a pet peeve of mine, is governmentalization or governmentality.
Oh, wow. Governmentalization.
Governmentalization or governmentality, a little bit of a pet peeve of a word. It's jargon. No one, it has a very particular definition from an author.
Sure.
But it's being picked up and it's used everywhere. So, yeah.
Hey, Phil, how many times can you use government or governmentality into one sentence?
I've actually done the math on that, Matt. So my worst sentence, which absolutely got rewritten, it had it 7 times in one sentence.
Wow. That's like, what is it? There's that sentence.
I'm applauding.
What is it? There's a sentence in linguistics that's famous because it uses the same. It's all one word. but it's like it's still a good grammatical sentence.
Right. Well, the one that I know is from Pierre Bourdieu, and it's about structures. So it's the structuring structures of structuralization.
Okay, it's
That's
something
structuration or
right.
something.
It's something like that where it's like it's I can't remember.
It's redonk, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the blue of blue, or it's wacky. Anyways,
imagine if you had to do the French translation on that.
I know
too.
that's terrible. You have to find all these other double entendre, all these other
What
secondary
structure is
meanings.
the male? Which one's the female?
Right. Actually, you reminded me just now of one of my other favorite ones that I've been using often at my work is RAGAGEP.
Ooh, what's
RAGAGEP
that?
stands for Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practices. It is a term from OSHA, from so
like a certification body.
Yeah, so OSHA is Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Right. So for engineering design, there are certain things that have to be designed based on RAGAGEP, which is Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practices. And so for like a long time at my job, every project has a folder that's labeled RAGAGEP, and I was like, what the hell? Just like, what is, I'm going to open it and a gnome is going to pop out and be like, I'm RAGAGEP. You know what I mean? Like, I had no concept of what the hell this word meant.
It sounds like the sound you would make if you fell into a heavy piece of machinery.
Right. It's right. It sounds like the sound you make when you're not wearing your what's it, your OSHA
harness.
Yeah, your OSHA recognized stuff, and you get hit on the face or something.
I'm just gonna say that's my new D&D name next time I play. That's where I'm going
RAGAGEP
in
the
at.
Destroyer. Yeah, it's fascinating.
RAGAGEP the machine.
I like it. RAGAGEP the machine's a great. I might have to go start a new.
That's a band.
New game of Dark Souls. So guys, actually, quick. So, well, not quick. We still got plenty of stuff to talk about here. But so for kind of our show, right? So we focus on, like I said earlier, weird stuff and these areas of kind of, I guess, these areas where real science and pseudoscience and groups of people that believe in fringe topics, right? Conspiracy groups and chat rooms and things like that, whatever, where they come together. And actually, one really interesting question that one question that's kind of reared its less than pretty head recently has been, what intersection is there between, say, far right, or not even far right necessarily, it doesn't have to just be far right, but between extremist groups and these communities of, say, occultism or conspiracy theory and stuff, right? So there's, in the United States at least, there's a very well-known phenomena where, militia groups and right-wing groups and stuff tend to center around conspiracy theories, right? So these concepts of the government coming to take away guns, or all these other kinds of notions and stuff. And on the other hand, the other edge of that, you have cults that tend to gravitate towards more kind of socialized visions of what a perfect utopia would be like, right? And then they oftentimes will mix in religion or esotericism or UFOs or whatever into that mix. I guess what's I don't know. I don't even know how to frame the question, but I guess what are your takes
Welcome
on that?
to the social sciences.
Right.
How do I even frame this?
The good sign of any sign of any good kind of thinker.
So I wrote a diagram down with 3 arrows pointing towards a central arrow and 4 words around it. So here we go. So like when you say extremism, far right, or we can also think of extremist ideologies like extremist religions, so say like the quote-unquote terrorists, Islamic terrorists. That's on one end, but then there's also, that's an ideology, right? Whether it's the alt-right or if it's like an ISIS type thing. I think these are ideologies that are individually focused, and they're also kind of hedonistic ideologies, including the occult. Like even if you're part of a cult and you're in this like group thing, you're focused on the one leader, right? Which is a very hedonistic, sort of individualistic setup for this ideology.
So actually,
I wonder, like, if it's an individualist thing versus a collective thing. I don't know.
So
that's my thoughts.
I actually think so. Hedonist. I think we're kind of thinking of it in different terms there, right? For me, hedonism is sort of the it's almost a giving away of oneself in the cult mentality, in my opinion, right? Because you're not necessarily trying to maximize your own pleasure or gain. You're trying to give away your pleasure and gain and stuff for the leader, right? Which to me almost seems like a
It's kind of communist or whatever.
it kind of seems to me to be almost a or like, I don't know, not because it is hedonism in a sense, but it's almost like a I don't know.
Because I think of the cult, like a cult, like our definition of what a cult would be, and the occult as different. Like
absolutely,
the occult is
absolutely.
black magic, Satanism,
Yes.
and Satanism is a religion. It just might not be an organized religion because there's not many churches around or whatever, right?
Sure.
It's hard, but those are, I think, like individual pleasure seeking sort of activities, and then even this extremism like terrorism and the alt-right, even within that, those are individuals who feel like they don't have any worth themselves, so they want to join this group so that they can individually gain more self-worth.
Okay, I understand.
That's what
I understand what you mean there. Okay.
But Phil's probably got some thoughts on this too. I don't want to take all the time.
As a dispassionate social scientist, I really don't see a difference between the right or the left on the political spectrum. I think they both have their myths of conspiracy. They attack generally the things that are most obvious: the government, money, big organizations. The CIA, FBI, those sorts of things always become a target for both the left and the right. When it comes to kind of occult groups, I'm not I don't side either way. I think some of the things that they do are grounded in fact, and I think some of the things that they do aren't, and that's their reality. So it's true to them. That's as a dispassionate kind of social scientist, right? They make their own kind of claims. Where I think we start running into problems, and I think Matt kind of alluded to it, is if you do have certain groups that are infringing on other people's rights or are hurting other people, that's where I think morality, questions of ethics need to kind of come in, right? And you can have your little cult group, but when you start killing people, that's a problem, right? When you start, overstepping that little boundary that you have, then it becomes an issue. And I'm not in a position to be able to criticize anybody for their views until they start infringing on other people's, really.
Yeah, and we call that in anthropology, at least, like relativism.
Yep.
We take that term from Einstein, I suppose, but it's basically like you don't judge another culture until they're breaking some of those sort of universal laws, like, and we try not to use terms like universal.
Well, I was going to say, and then the question becomes, what are those universal laws? Right, of course.
So, and this was, like some of them would be like sexual assault, harming minors, and like murder and
we have
assault,
things
like
that we consider to be
they transcend culture.
Right, but even some of those though.
What about cannibalism?
Right, even some of those become questionable, right? To become kind of interesting, or I'm even thinking of, besides cannibalism, other ways that we deal with the dead, or even say things like multiple marriages or child marriages or things like that. Like we have things that we in the West would consider to be taboo, very
There's some pretty kooky like puberty rituals out there as well.
Exactly,
you would look
right?
at, you'd be like, what?
Yeah, what I mean. And again, like it is important, I think, for us to be cognizant of our own biases and things, right? But it does become kind of a it's interesting. It's a huge question. It's a question that
Yeah, I'm gonna interject again here because I said something, and I think we need to explore just a tad bit more. I said because at first I kind of said as long as they're not hurting anybody, it's okay, and everyone agrees with that. But then if we think for a second about what that means to hurt someone, then it becomes a lot more murkier. So I'm gonna take the example of anti-vaxxers, right? They can think that vaccines are going to do them harm, and this is probably across the political spectrum, right, left, moderate, independent, whatever, right? There are anti-vaxxers everywhere. But is it hurtful to go on Facebook and post basically anti-science and anti-vaccine posts to try to convince other people not to inoculate their children or not to vaccinate their children? And that is a really complicated question.
Right.
And
Is lying in itself doing harm?
well, exactly.
And also, is the intent there to lie as well, right? Like, is that their intention, or are they also misled? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
like their intentions can very well be just to spread information that they believe is true and factual and grounded in their own form of scientific belief. But then it might be reviewed by like an expert panel and determined to be less than factual and actually misinformation. And then who gets to make those decisions, right? These are the sorts of ethical debates, I think, that we're having in the social sciences, and I think in the hard sciences like medicine or even engineering, right?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, one interesting question. So I had an interesting thing that happened to me today, that kind of goes along with this. Was I'm part of a bunch of different I am part of a bunch of different kind of Facebook groups that talk about people that claim to have experienced things like alien abduction or contact with God or any of that kind of stuff, right? Because for the show, it's I think it is very interesting to get that viewpoint and see what people are really saying, right? And seeing how this idea evolves over time in some ways.
Right.
Today, though, someone posted a thing that basically, I'm not going to give the specifics, but basically they were describing what to me sounded like a very serious neurological emergency, right?
Yeah,
and
like a fugue state or something like that, right?
Well, a seizure, a stroke, something like that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I can see that.
And so I basically on their post I said, go to a doctor immediately, right? I said, I am not a doctor. I'm not a medical doctor, but to me, if one of my family members was showing those symptoms, I would drive them to the hospital, now.
Yeah, you can see the signs of it, something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the comments on it was, well, if you're feeling okay now, because basically this was a group of people who claimed to have been abducted by aliens. And so the person was asking, was I just abducted? Right. I woke up on the floor. I couldn't move my legs at first. I'm having trouble focusing, etc., etc. Was I just abducted by aliens? In my mind, no, your brain
probably just had a stroke.
Right. Something terrible has just happened to your brain. You better get to a hospital. And, I kind of got into a little bit, not an argument per se, but a little bit of a dispute with someone who was like, well, why would you say that? That's so scary for this person, yada, yada, whatever. And, I just kept saying like, well, listen, like I'm just saying you should go to a doctor. To me, it doesn't matter if you're afraid or not. Like I would be afraid if that happened to me.
Okay.
So go to a doctor.
Even if it is a real abduction, go to a doctor. I'm just going to say that, right? Like, because yes, it is a scary thing. So yeah.
Right. Like it does yeah, to me, to ethically investigate these things, that's kind of what I'm getting at. To ethically investigate things like the paranormal, what you have to be sure of it before you begin any kind of delving into the paranormal options or the UFO options or whatever is get the mundane stuff out of the way first, right? If you go to a doctor and they tell you, no, you're totally healthy, there's nothing wrong, you got nothing on your brain, whatever, everything's all good, then maybe you can start going to a past life regressionist if you want to, right? But until then, it is unethical for someone to suggest it as the first option, in my mind, right? But that's, I guess, kind of the question I want to put to you guys, right? Is how does one, if the ultimate reality of, let's take UFOs, right? If the ultimate reality of aliens is not true, okay, let's just take that as our initial assumption. It's not true. There are no aliens. We are alone in the universe. Aliens haven't visited the planet Earth, whatever. Then is it ethical to tell someone who has had a medical situation like this, who thinks they might have been abducted, that they could have been and they should go talk to an expert on abductions? Is that ethical? And then if aliens are real, is it ethical? Does the existence, the underlying existence of the thing change it? Right?
For me, no. The existence of the phenomena is a separate thing than the lived reality of that awfulness of blacking out and waking up and being scared. And I think finding root causes is kind of like the immediate sort of thing that we do in our society currently. And I think sometimes we need to take a step back from that and just kind of I'm sorry to say this, but be a fucking human being. Like,
Sure.
if you have a
Sure,
headache,
sure.
how about we treat the headache first, and then we'll get to the root causes after, right?
Sure.
If I break my leg, the doctor isn't going to give me a lesson about why I shouldn't climb a ladder the way I did. He's going to treat the leg. He's going to, like, put it back in place, put a plaster on it, a cast, and then maybe I'll get a little moral story about how to climb the ladder safer the next time. So we do that. We have that approach of treating pain and then dealing with the effects of it, and then dealing with the causes later all the time. So why wouldn't we do it in a world in which aliens exist or aliens
Right.
don't?
The
It doesn't
emotional
change
trauma.
that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's my
That's
approach, and I think Matt might have a similar sort of answer, but
Yeah, totally. I was thinking more in a completely different direction, so I'm like just trying to gather two thoughts at the same time. But I was thinking more like I feel like I'm more of a believer. I kind of believe in aliens a little bit, and that's okay because I study anthropology.
Dude,
and
no, I mean, listen.
we veer in that direction a little bit more.
like,
We're like,
well,
hey, whatever you say, man. But no, but what I find fascinating is like you see throughout the archaeological record, let's just say, signs of people trying to make sense of the things they don't understand. Now, if you're somebody without any sort of even first aid training or whatever, and you don't know what the signs of stroke are or whatever, you might miss that. Or if you're the person who just had possibly a stroke, you're going to be confused, so you might not be able to rationally put that all together. So that should be taken into consideration. But people have always kind of made attempts to attach meanings, symbolic meanings, to the inexplicable, So I think in the vast majority of cases, that's what's happening with aliens. But then I think, well, mathematically, they have to be out there, right? So like that's how I come down. So
but the point still
try not
stands,
to
though.
go.
But the point still stands.
Yeah. Oh yeah, about the stroke thing. Yeah, go to a doctor, man. Like
right. But I think though, because actually that is a question that has been sort of racking my mind since before even that I went on this kind of wacky MUFON roller coaster, right? Was
right.
How to actually do this study, how to do this study ethically if the ultimate reality of what these people are claiming is not true, right? So, if you if someone comes to you and says they're very, very afraid of an alien or a UFO or something because they saw one and they're wondering now, are they going to come abduct them, right? Something like that. To me, it would seem to be right. So some people would tell these people, well, you should get, you can run the gamut, right? Some people would say, well, they're not real. Don't worry. There's no evidence. They, even if you take it to be the fact that they're real, none of our evidence shows that, just because you see one means you're about to get abducted. None of that's true. Other people, though, on the same spectrum would say, well, they are real. I know from my personal experience, right, that if you put this crystal in your house, it'll keep them from your house, or
right.
Whatever, right? If you pray to God, it'll stop them from coming, whatever.
Right.
To me, I get what you're saying, Phil, that you should, what's the word? You should be cognizant and kind and nurturing in some ways, because these people did just have a scary experience, right? And so, ultimately, treat people the way that you want to be treated, right? If I had a scary experience, regardless of what it was, I would hope someone would be nice to me, right? So you should be kind. But in my mind, it gets back to that ultimate question of, well, is it momentarily kind to be, to buy into this fear that they have, or to buy into this fantasy, and then to let them believe a falsehood? Or is it more kind or ultimately better in some way, ethically, to give them the truth of the matter as it stands, and I guess sort of, let them maybe momentarily be uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, and I think.
Yeah. Okay. I guess.
Okay.
No,
so
go ahead after you, Phil.
Here's my issue with that. Okay, I'm not gonna give anybody a crystal to put in their house. Okay,
sure, of course.
I don't think anybody here is, but we'd be put in a situation where we'd be sending them to someone who has the crystals and the supposed knowledge of crystals, right? And I think that decision to say, oh, you had a genuine encounter and you need some crystals in your house, go see this person, is irresponsible. If they seek that person out on their own and they're willing to do that, then so be it. But I am not in a position to refer anybody to help them come to terms with either accepting or not accepting that there are extraterrestrials. And by the way, I'm just going to agree with you too. I am a full-on believer. Like, I think it is ridiculous to think that we are alone in this universe, right?
Yeah, that's how I come
have
around to.
Have I had an encounter?
Ridiculous.
No. I'm not going to say I want to have one because it certainly sounds scary. But if my neighbor came to me and said I saw something, like I'm going nuts and I'm scared, I wouldn't tell him to go see a hypnotist. Like, I think that's irresponsible.
But would you tell them to go see a psychiatrist?
You'd probably look at his pupils first, man.
Yeah, I think.
But you know what I'm saying though? Like, because to me, I guess the question. I mean, I think this is a thing. We could do another hour talking about this one question, right? I think it's ultimately the question that comes down to anything like this, right? But I think it's an important question though, that those in the field right now doing this kind of work maybe have never asked themselves it.
Yeah. So can I just so I don't forget, I just wanted to throw this into the mix for whatever it's worth. But in like the fields of anthropology, the topics we discuss and the nature of our research, because we're going and engaging with people on one-on-one and having like long, intimate conversations with them, stuff that is not within our research tends to come up. So like you might be talking about something completely unrelated and it might veer into a territory and somebody tells you about a sexual assault, right? And there are principles in anthropology and there's certain research and ethics board approval processes that are similar to the sciences, but obviously a little bit different. So we have these sort of supposedly like ethics and rules around how we're supposed to deal with this, but the golden rule in anthropology, and it's shared in a lot of disciplines, especially the health sciences, is do no harm. Like, make sure your research does no harm. So if you are doing research on UFOs, which is totally valid, Phil and I both agree, but if that research does harm, that's where there's a problem, right? So if you are sending somebody who has a medical or a suspected medical condition even to some crystal healer, that's dangerous, right? But if you send them to a chiropractor, like if I send Phil to a chiropractor, that's not that crazy. Like, I've seen chiropractors help people with back issues. So you want your work to do no harm. And then also, you also need to protect yourself legally, right? Like, if somebody tells you that they've been, I remember you mentioned this, Chris, on a previous show, but like if somebody describes something like a probing, and if it's a woman describing this to you, you have a responsibility to think, is this woman actually describing a sexual assault?
Right.
And is it so traumatic that some sort of hallucination maybe happened? I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but you have a legal responsibility to report that. And also if it's somebody who's like an adult and they're relating a story to you from when they were a child, that's a legal quagmire as well, right?
Sure, yeah, of course. If the ultimate question becomes, I think it's a question that comes up a lot in these cases, is one of the possible explanations for the abduction phenomena is people potentially being assaulted, right, in some way, and it being a cover, or not a cover necessarily, being a way to repress or change that memory to make it more palatable to the person. Well, guys, this has been a seriously well, yeah. I mean, we had to end it somewhere, and it couldn't be on jargon.
End it on probing,
right? We're gonna end it here on a kind of a dark note, but that's fine, guys. It has been extremely interesting, super fascinating. That's completely why I really enjoy your podcast.
Awesome. Thank you.
Folks, if you're listening to this and you like it, go check out the Semi-Intellectual Musings podcast. You can find it on all of the places where you get your podcast. Where do you guys have a website yet?
We do. It's listen.podbean.com. We're on Twitter, quite frequently on Twitter and active. We're at _SIM_POD. We also have a Facebook page at the SimPod. You can email us, semiintellectual@gmail.com. We would love some iTunes reviews because we're the podcast that asks for them when no one else does, right?
Yeah.
But
You heard it here first,
Thank
folks.
God somebody's asking for
Great
iTunes
I know no
reviews,
one's asking
finally.
right now, so figured corner the market, be the only guys who ask for them. But if you do, we're gonna plug your show, or you as an individual who doesn't have a show, or if you're an alien and you're listening, tell us what part of the quadrant you're in. Tell us if you've seen the Borg. I'm really interested to know that. So yeah.
Good stuff, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks
Well,
for having
thank
us.
you for having us.
No
Yeah.
problem. And I am, super excited to have you guys on again sometime.
Anytime, man.
Cool. Thanks so much.
You'll
All
have to
right,
come on our show.
I definitely will. I'm telling you. All right, folks.
Hey, I didn't agree to anything.
I see how it is. No, it's fine. Whatever. It's cool. All right. Well, this episode's going right in the trash. Folks, again, Semi-Intellectual Musings. Go check it out. Matt, Phil, thanks so much for coming on. And go out, listen, rate and review them. They're a great show, really putting out some really interesting stuff. And yeah, go take a listen. So we'll be back again soon with a full episode featuring myself and Marie. All right. Thanks so much for listening. Good night.